Welcome to part 45 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this final video, we'll take a moment to clean things up and fix a few lingering bugs, like preventing the player from attacking during the door transitions, resolving issues with taking damage when opening chests, and hiding any leftover debug visuals. It's all about polishing the game and wrapping things up. If you're new here, this is part of a complete series where we built a Zelda-inspired game from scratch, using Phaser 3. Be sure to check out the playlist link in the description to watch from the beginning. Alright, let's squash some bugs and bring our adventure to a close. So now we wrapped up our section on our challenging boss fight, there's just a few things we want to address in our game before we wrap up. There's a few existing bugs in our code that we'll want to address, and we'll want to update our game's configuration so we hide our debug information. For the first bug we're going to take a look at is when our player goes to open up one of our chests, if we're in the middle of opening up one of our chests when we take damage, our player never actually gets the item. So what's happening is once we go to open up our chest, we're transitioning into our open chest state. Once we get into this state, we play our animation, and now we emit our event, and we're waiting for our dialogue to close to show that we received our item. Because we take damage, we immediately transition to our hurt state, and so our logic doesn't actually run. To fix this, once we enter this state, we're going to make our player invulnerable, so then that way if we take any damage, it won't affect our current state. Once we actually get our item and we close our dialogue, then we'll make our player vulnerable again, so then that way we'll be able to take damage. To make these changes, we'll go into our open chest state. Before we reset our body's velocity, let's update our invulnerable component. So we're going to do this, our game object. We're going to reference our invulnerable component. We're going to set invulnerable. We're going to set it to be true. And we're going to copy that line of code. Let's come down to our event listener for when our dialogue closes. Before we go back to our idle state, now we want to make our player vulnerable again. So now if we save, we should be able to test. So now when we open up our chest, when our enemy collides with our player, we don't actually take damage since we're invulnerable. For our next bug, when our player goes to move through one of our doors, currently we're checking our input to make sure our player can actually change their direction. However, our player can still use their items and attack with their sword. To address this, we'll need to update our idle state, and if our lock is enabled on our controls, we won't want to process any of our input. To make this change, let's go into our idle state. Let's go down to our onUpdate method. Once we get a reference to our controls, so let's do if, let's reference our controls, then we'll check to see if our movement is locked, and if it is, we just want to return early from our method. So now back in our browser, if we try moving through one of our doors, if we try pressing our attack key, we'll see now we no longer process our input and we don't go to our attack state. Much better. So now that we've addressed our two bugs, now we want to update our game configuration to hide our debug zones. To do this, let's go into our config file. At the top of our file, let's update our alpha for our collision area to be 0. Now to hide our physics bodies, we'll need to update our phaser game configuration. So if we go into our main.ts file, in our game config, we'll want to go to our arcade physics, and we'll set debug to be false. And then finally, we just need to add in logic to hide our debug zones for our door triggers. To do that, we're going to add a new flag to our configuration, and then when it's set to true, we'll enable our debugging, and if it's set to false, we won't create that game object. So let's go into our config file, let's copy our line of code for where we enable our logging, we'll update our variable name, and we're going to do enable debug zone area. Let's set this to be true. Alright, so now we just need to update our door class. So in our door class, in our constructor, before we create our game object for our debug door transition zone, this is where we'll add a check for that new flag. So we'll do if, we'll do our enable debug zone area, and only if that flag is set to true will we create our game object. So once we save, when our browser refreshes, we should still see our game object in our scene. Now if we come back to our config file, let's set this to be false, and now our game object should not be created. Nice. And that's a wrap. We've come a long way together, starting from a project template all the way to building a fully playable Zelda-inspired dungeon adventure in Phaser 3. Along the way, we've tackled core gameplay systems like movement, combat, item collection, enemy AI, puzzles, a boss battle, UI components, and even connected it all with tile data. Whether you followed every single part or just jumped in for the pieces you needed, thank you so much for watching and building alongside me. I hope this series helped level up your Phaser skills and gave you the confidence to start creating your own action-adventure games. If you enjoyed the series, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with other devs who might find it helpful. If you want to support my work or follow future projects, you can find all the links in the description below. Thanks again for being part of this journey, and as always, happy coding and keep making awesome games.